Hi everyone, and welcome to CWA Presents, the YouTube edition. My name is Sandra Colbert. I'm a board member of the Chicago Writers Association and moderator of CWA Presents. When we began doing CWA Presents, it was before a live audience at the Chicago Cultural Center, and like everything else, we've had to adapt. So we are doing this as a YouTube event. But especially the writers out there, take some time, go to YouTube and type in Chicago Writers Association and check out some of the videos that we've done in the past. I think you'll be really impressed. And also check out Chicago Writers Association as well, especially if you are a writer. And when you are there, just feel free to hit that subscribe button. Today we're at After-words Bookstore at 23 East Illinois, the North Loop, another great independent bookstore. And joining us today, and I'm very pleased to introduce Bev Dvorkin, the owner of After-words. Welcome, Bev, to CWA Presents.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to participate in your event.
Well, we're glad to do anything to promote the independent bookstore, because we are a writers association, and we know the importance and the value of the indie bookstores.
Thank you. I think that we have always enjoyed a great relationship with an amazing community of local writers here. And, during this pandemic, I think that I've missed sort of the ability to meet new authors and sort of talk to them about their books and all the things that I'm used to doing sort of in the pre-COVID world.
Right. Hopefully we'll get back to normal. Tell us about yourself and your bookstore.
Okay, so first of all, my name is Beverly Dvorkin. I started this bookstore in the fall of 1996. I started out just with this big empty space and 6 months of just cleaning it out. River North in those days wasn't called River North. It was just sort of this north of the Loop area with a lot of empty warehouse space. I believe that this space was empty from the mid-50s until I came into it in 1996.
Do you know what it was at one point?
I didn't know. And the building was built in 1896, so not
wow.
too long after the fire. And everything in this neighborhood did burn in the fire. So most of the buildings, there wouldn't be anything older than the fire for the most part in this neighborhood. And a lot, obviously, that's newer, because Chicago likes to rebuild itself.
Yes.
But I did have a customer come in who told me, who just looked around the space amazed and told me that he had worked in this building in the 1950s and that it had been a candy factory.
Really?
So this neighborhood has a history with that, so I don't know that to be true, but I do know that that's what he told me.
Right. Well, that's impressive, going from one treat to a bookstore. So that's pretty good.
Right.
Not too shabby. And so you said 1996, so you've seen a lot of changes in the industry and in Chicago. And
well, so I opened my doors in May of 1997. It was not a neighborhood that was looked at as necessarily a place where you might put a business like this one, frankly. But it was a lot of space and it was inexpensive. I know that sounds crazy to say that about River North now, but it really was. Nobody wanted it, so.
Well, it must have taken a certain amount of courage for you to jump into a bookstore.
I was 26 years old, so maybe more full of hubris than I should have been.
Right.
But I'd been working in books since I was 15.
Okay.
I worked at Crocs and Brentanos as a teenager.
Yes, right.
Not in the city, in the suburbs, actually. They had an Oak bookstore, and I grew up in Lombard. And you probably remember Crocs and Brentanos.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful memories.
Yeah,
yes.
for sure. I loved working for them.
Yeah.
And so they sort of got me. I think that's where I first got enchanted with it, really.
Right.
I did go to school in Boston after I graduated from high school, and I did work in bookstores there, a local chain there called Laureate's, which is also now defunct. They were similar to K&B. Not their stores weren't quite as large or as diverse in their selections, but they did have a really great local audience there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but both of these chains are long gone.
Yeah. Well, I worked at Walden Books for a while, and they were starting to disappear, I think, by the mid-90s.
Right.
Yeah.
And Crown Books was the next stop for me.
Right.
And so, so all of these chains are gone, so I hope it wasn't me.
Well, they were the ones knocking out the little stores at the malls. I know that's what Walden Books did. So there was a bookstore in the mall that I was at, but it didn't last long after Walden Books moved in.
So that would have been in the 90s?
80s.
80s.
Yeah.
Right, so that was sort of the first wave of those things, I think, of closings of indies as like there were chains coming in.
Right.
And then, of course, by the time I got started with my own place, there was Borders and Barnes & Noble were the two big ones.
Right.
And Amazon debuted the same year that I opened my doors.
Oh,
Their
my
business
gosh.
model was a little bit different than mine.
Yes.
And I think just a little bit more successful.
Oh.
But I think that I don't want to get into a treatise on Amazon
Right,
because
right.
there's
enough people doing that. Yes.
correct. And honestly, I think that I look at them as I looked at any other chain store pretty much. I knew that Borders had two stores around me here. They had one up on Michigan Avenue and they had one on State Street, both of which were walkable from here. There was a Barnes & Noble, also walkable from here. That was the last one to close. That actually closed just before the pandemic. Although, again, I don't think it was a victim of the pandemic. I do think that the neighborhood was planning to knock down the building and put up like a 40-story place for apartments and stuff. And there's been a lot of that. And so that's one of the big changes in the neighborhood, right, is that we have now quite a lot of people living in what John Buck christened River North.
Yes, yeah. Well, and these are the people, they're probably better educated, better income, and they love to browse in a bookstore.
I do. We have had, I think if it wasn't interrupted by the pandemic, we were seeing some of the best sales in our history.
Wow.
And that was in 2019.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, tell us about the pandemic. How did it affect you? How did you adjust to it?
Well, I think, at first, so the weekend that comes to mind, I think, is the weekend of St. Patrick's Day weekend, which is a very big weekend in River North, and not one I usually particularly enjoy as a bookseller.
Right.
But it last year at the beginning of the pandemic, unfortunately, most people were doing what they always do on that weekend, and literally the Monday after the governor said, "That's it, I'm shutting things down." So the following Friday we closed, and were closed until about the 6th of June, I think it was. Maybe it was the 4th. I can't quite remember the date, but it was when the mayor finally gave the okay that in the city we could reopen our businesses. I'm very fortunate in that I have this amazing staff. Most of us have been together for 15 plus years. I couldn't imagine doing this without them. And
you were able to keep your staff?
I was able to keep all of them.
Wonderful.
I paid them to stay home, and that was really important to me, actually. I'm not sure that I would, frankly, want to keep doing this without the group that I've sort of been fortunate enough to assemble. My husband and I run this place together now and have for many years, and we have a core of 3 other staff members who are sort of, to me, I don't know that I would do this without them at this point. So it was really never a question or a choice. It was simply, I'm keeping them.
Oh, well, that's good news. I don't think people realize, unless you've worked in a bookstore, how much work is involved in a bookstore. It's a lot of hard work.
I think people have this lovely notion that we get to sit and read books all day.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wish that were
books,
true, because that is something I would love. But the truth of the matter is, like, for me personally, obviously, as an entrepreneur, I still have all the things to do that go with any business. So payrolls and schedules and taxes and ordering and budgeting and advertising and all of those things. As far as my staff goes, they are helping me choose books for the store all the time. We're constantly reading, we're constantly looking. That we are also a used bookstore, so my staff spends a lot of time buying, cleaning, repairing books. We give them a lot of love in here. I like to tell people when they sell us their books that we're giving them a good home, and I want to mean that.
Yeah.
Because some people look at their books as their old friends, right? When they have their collection, they might have, I don't know, 500 books that they're selling to us or that they're trading with us. And we want, one of the things that we need to do, especially if there's been a death in the family or there's been a change in circumstance that's traumatic, like getting rid of these things can be really it can focus more trauma on the situation.
Exactly.
And so we try to help people with that and make them feel comfortable, and sometimes when they come in and they see the kind of place that it's going to, it feels good to them, and I'm glad for that.
My husband still has books that he got when he was like 8, 9, and 10 years old, and he still has them all these many decades later, and they're in bad shape. And I've once mentioned something about we should get rid of these, and I thought he was going to have a heart attack. No, you can't get rid of those. I read those as a little boy. Okay, we would, so people do really attach. I've got a lot of books I'm so attached to.
And it's a physical object, right? I mean, and I don't think that the ebook will ever compete with that. Like, can you imagine sitting with your grandchild on your lap and reading the book and showing them the pictures, right? Or are you imagining sitting with an iPad and scrolling through? Like, which one feels more like something that you would want to be doing? Yeah.
When I was at one of the other bookstores, he said that during COVID there was a huge uptick in children's books. Are you seeing that? You're selling more children's books than before?
That's interesting. I think the uptick in children's books happened for us about 5 years ago, actually. One of the things that's so great is that there's been this commitment by publishers to bring diversity into children's books, experiences from other cultures, experiences. There have been so many stories for so many years, and they're wonderful stories, and I don't want to, put those down, right? Like, I'm not going to criticize people for reading Dr. Seuss to their children, but there are so many wonderful stories that are now being published from the Asian American community, the African American community. There's a young adult novel by a local author called I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, and she grew up in Little Village, I believe, and but don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. But she did definitely grow up in the Mexican American part of the city, and and that's been a bestseller for us. So there is an audience for these stories, and it's not just an audience of color, it's a white audience too. I think we are hungry to hear those stories about these other communities in our own city, right? And so that's where I've seen the uptick, and I've been really excited about that, bringing in other voices that I haven't necessarily had the opportunity to bring in say in the late 90s or the early 2000s. You asked me about things that changed in the neighborhood around the bookstore. Well, this is something that's changed within the book industry itself, this commitment to trying to bring more of these voices. And we still need more, right? But I think that there's definitely been a solid movement in the right direction in the last decade.
Well, even as an adult reader, I've read books on Iran and Iraq and places I didn't give much thought to. Vietnam, during the war. I've read several books now that are novels about what the people in Vietnam were going through. We always knew just what was on the news. But all of a sudden you're reading about what the peasant farmer in Vietnam was living through. So it's, you could start as a child and expand and see the whole world, and I think it's great that they're doing that, because it's going to keep the child's interest. Maybe I want to learn more about Mexico. I want to learn more about South America.
Right, or like you said Vietnam, well, The Sympathizer, right? I mean, that's been a bestseller here in the U.S., and, that is a Vietnamese American story, right?
Right.
And he has a new novel out, actually, in the last couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I read The Monkey Bridge. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No,
Gosh, it's so good. So good. Anyway, we could probably do this all
Oh, yeah,
day,
we
you
could.
know? This book was so good. Do you feel like things are returning to normal?
Oh, that's a complex question. I definitely see people coming out a little bit more. I see certainly, so I would say on an average weekday in 2019, we had probably about 150 people through here on the average weekday, probably about 400 on the average Saturday, and probably about 200, 250 on the average Sunday. At this point, I think we're maybe seeing 50 to 75 people coming through here on the average weekday, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 people on the average Saturday, and we're closed on Sundays still.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that is that we've had to change our hours as a result of the pandemic. We need more hours to work on shipping things to people, because that's sort of a side of the business that's grown during the pandemic. And so we can't, it's hard to be open during those hours and also have staff, because we can't have as many staff members in at the same time as we used to. We need to spread it out. So there need to be hours here where the staff can be here doing things where we're not open to the public, and then hours where we are open to the public and don't have as many staff members around, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, that definitely does make sense. Well, let's talk about books.
Always.
What titles are selling right now? What do you see? Is it the dystopian novel? Or is it?
Well, so I've definitely seen an uptick in poetry and philosophy.
Oh, great.
Which and some of that is the success, obviously, of certain sort of young adult writers like Rupi Kaur, the Indian American author, who basically her first poetry collection came out about 8 years ago, and Beyonce tweeted to her gajillion followers that this was her favorite poetry she'd ever read, and instantly Rupi Kaur hit the top of the bestseller lists. She had a third book come out in November. It got a little bit lost in the pandemic, but we've been selling that very well. We've been seeing certainly Amanda Gorman's book, her poem in book form from the inaugural, because I think the entire world fell in love with this young woman in about 5 minutes on Inauguration Day this year.
Yeah, they talk more about her than Biden, I think. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And it was great. I mean, a world where we're talking more about a poet than we are about a president.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so, yes, so I've seen, and I see these authors as sort of gateway drugs to other poets. We have a really amazing local poetry community here too.
Oh, good.
Authors like Eve Ewing or Danny Koval. These are poets who have put out a lot of diverse voices and brought a lot more people into reading poetry. So, and then I guess classical philosophy would be the other place where I've seen a lot. Now, we've always sold Camus well, but I have never seen an uptick in existentialist.
Really?
Like
That's
this.
really interesting. Yeah, that says something.
So the pandemic brought that, and as well as Marcus Aurelius.
Really?
Yeah. Where we might have sold, 100 copies a year of Marcus Aurelius pre-pandemic, I think during 2020 we sold almost 300 copies of the Meditations. And it's Stoicism, right?
Yes.
So these are the two philosophies that people, I think that they're grappling with a lot with the pandemic. And who do you turn to? Well, you turn to the poets and you turn to the philosophers.
Have you been selling a lot of cookbooks?
Yes, but not as many as pre-pandemic, actually.
Really?
But I think that's a function of this neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of restaurants in
Yeah,
this
this is
neighborhood.
true, yes.
Yeah, some really good ones. And many of the chefs are our customers, and they tend to buy a lot of cookbooks. And most of them have not had the resources or time or energy, I think, for rebuilding menus in creative ways during the pandemic, so that we haven't seen the cookbook sales from them that we're used to.
Right.
But yes, I mean, people in their own homes for sure. For sure, one of the things I noticed right away was that people were interested in cocktail cookbooks quite a bit.
Really?
Oh yes.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
Well, you know, the bars were closed. You
Yeah,
got to learn
yeah.
how to make your own, right?
Make your own martini. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I had heard about a surge in cookbooks. And I didn't know about cocktails. That's great.
Well, that's one of the categories of them, right?
Yeah. That's great. Who else? What else?
Who else? Well, you know, so the ones that I think what's been surprising is the ones that you'd expect to be huge
Right.
weren't huge in the same way in 2020. J.K. Rowling had a new book called Ichabod, a children's book. I haven't seen much in the way of sales for that. Suzanne Collins had a prequel to her Hunger Games trilogy. These are in a normal year, these would have been very, very big releases. Her book was dropped in May, while we were closed. Actually, we were able at that point to have staff in the store, but nobody else. We were allowed to do that, so we had brought just a couple of staff members back to do some work.
Right.
And so we were starting to try to receive some books, and that is one of the ones we got. And I would say we sold a third of the number of copies that I would expect on a book like that.
Yeah, not a lot of rhyme and reason this
No.
last year.
No, it's different. I think, and you know, it's a function of the kind of bookstore that we are too, right?
Right.
I mean, we're not just a new bookstore. We're half and half, new and used books. So people do come to us for different reasons maybe than they do to your typical indie that might only be new books. I think that the latest bestseller is not necessarily what we carry or what people are looking for from us. Also, starting out around the same time as Amazon, as I said, one of the things that I saw was within the latest James Patterson or the latest,
Right.
you know, sort of best-selling fiction writer had a book come out that Amazon was discounting them in a way that I could never even hope to compete with.
Right.
So I didn't try.
Right, right.
What I would do is try to focus on his backlist, or get the $9.99 paperbacks, or pick up used copies of some of his hardbacks. And then he'd have a new book, and so people would come in and say, do you have the new book? And I'd say, no, but I have these 30 others by him. Would you be interested in one of those?
Right, right.
And sometimes and not everyone would go for that, but you know, some people have read everything as it comes out, and that's fine. But not everyone has. And so then they go, oh, well, maybe I missed a few. So let me go back and try those too. And then also, we are able to, in that way, help people discover lesser known authors, because we can afford to focus to buy used books by authors. And then when we sell the used books, we go, oh, now we're creating an audience for this. Now maybe we're going to order those as new books from the publishers to replace the copies we've sold used. And so it kind of works in a symbiotic way. And so, and that's always been true. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you have the ability to adjust to changing markets and changing times, and that's probably helped you a lot.
When I was going into my history, I didn't mention that also, aside from working in new bookstores, I worked for a used book dealer called Second Story Books in Washington, D.C. I lived there for a few years, and I learned a lot about book repair and about you know, salvaging books, and you know, and salvaging that history, frankly. And for a lot of families, I think that can be an important thing. But also, you get these beautiful old volumes that have leather bindings, or you know, and they make sort of like a facsimile of this now, where they use sort of a faux leather, and they're sort of, it's like a soft sort of binding, if you know what I'm talking about. It's not a soft back and it's not a hard back, but it's just, they used to do it with soft leather. Now they do it sort of with a mix of plastics, I think.
Okay.
But they make nice books just the same. Somebody
Right.
like Canterbury Classics.
Right.
But you had these sort of flexi-bound books. That's what I call them. I don't know if anybody else does, where it is where you could lay them flat on a table and read them, and it wouldn't hurt the binding. But they weren't softbacks, and they were made of leather. So we see a lot of these as secondhand books, and so we want to preserve that leather, and we want to preserve those as well. You know, the book as an object is also part of what we do here, right? It's not just that. It's not just what's written in it, but it's the object itself. We have a lot of customers who will read ebooks, but then if they really like it, they'll go and they'll buy the quote real book. That's what they say, their word, not mine.
Right.
I want the real book to put on my shelf, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's because, so then in fact the author, which is great for them, is getting that sale not once but twice. Because it's something where they said, wow, this is so good. I want to display it proudly on my shelf to tell all my friends and family that this is great and that I read it.
Yes.
And you can't do that in the virtual world in the same way.
Yeah.
So yeah, we see a lot of that too. I think the big loss for us in this in the pandemic in this neighborhood has been that we don't have the tourism, and and a third of our business comes from the hotels in this neighborhood, and that's what we haven't been able to recover. We were able to recover pretty quickly, actually, over the first 3 months we were reopened. Our very loyal customer base, and I cannot say thank you to them enough. You know, they bought gift certificates in surprisingly large denominations.
Oh, that's great.
They responded to our joining a group called bookshop.org online, which I'm not sure if any of the other new booksellers you've talked to have talked about them, but they gave a resource to booksellers. So instead of buying books from Amazon online, you can buy from bookshop.org.
Oh, yes. They have mentioned that. I know what you're talking about now.
Right.
Yes.
10% of every sale goes into a pool that is then divided among the member indie bookstores around the country. It's all ABA members. I think there's about 1,200 of us now. When I joined, I think I was, there were maybe 600 or 700. They had literally just launched at the end of 2019. They had launched pre-pandemic, not really thinking about the pandemic, but the timing worked out perfectly for us as booksellers.
So between buying and selling books and repairing books, what kind of books do you read? Or do you get a chance to read?
Oh, I do. It's funny. The time in my life when I read the least number of books was the first 5 years that I owned a bookstore. And I think that you might hear that from other book dealers as well.
Yes.
Because you might read you read catalogs and synopses, and you read the backs of books a lot, and you read the first chapter of something maybe.
Right.
But now I do have time to read. I try to read advances that publishers send me that I'm interested in. I try not to have them send ones to me that aren't of interest and that no one on staff is going to read. It's just a waste. So during the pandemic, I started to read Eric Larson's latest book. I've read most of his books.
Yeah, me too.
And I absolutely adore the way he writes, and I'm fascinated by his topics. I read his book on the Lusitania, Dead Wake, and Devil in the White City, of course, and which is still, by the way, I don't know how many years after it came out, probably 18, 20, our #1 best-selling book. During non-pandemic times, this will tell you about this neighborhood, we sell about 30 copies a month.
Wow, that is amazing.
Right. So
Somebody
that's gone, by the way. We might, during the pandemic, we've been lucky to sell 4 or 5 most
Well, now
months.
the movie's coming out.
Well, I mean, everything gets optioned. Absolutely
Right,
everything.
right.
You know,
I think it's Brad Pitt too, isn't it? Or Leo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio,
Yeah,
Martin
yeah.
Scorsese. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this one will actually happen. Those names attached makes it seem like maybe,
Right,
but I'll tell you the story of Confederacy of Dunces.
Oh, yes. I'm rereading that, as a matter of fact.
Great book, right? My husband, one of his favorites.
Yes.
So back in the 70s, John Belushi was attached to play the main character
Right.
in that movie. And then after he died, it moved to John Candy. And after he died, it was Chris Farley.
Chris Farley, yes.
Right. And so, and it still hasn't happened. So all I'm saying is that, you know, film versions are possible, but what Hollywood likes to do is option things at the beginning because it's a cheap way to get the rights from the author. And I'm not saying it's a bad deal for the author, by the way. That's not
Right,
for me to
right,
say.
right.
But I think that being paid to write a actual screenplay, a new one, as opposed to adapt a book, is a much bigger expense. And the author makes quite a bit more, and usually gets quite a better piece of that movie. And that's not 100% true. I think, like, you look at a local author like Gillian Flynn.
Yes, my favorite, yeah.
Right, exactly, and she amazing. I did an event with her back about 4 or 5 years ago, but she really funny and warm and all of that. But I think she's done very well with the adaptations of her 3 books.
Right, but she was involved in them.
Right, she was very much involved in
Yes,
writing for the screen
yes.
and all of that too. But and she, because of the success of her books, especially Gone Girl, but really all 3 of them, because
Right.
once people fell in love with the 3rd book, they went back and read the first 2.
Right.
So when we're talking about that, like, I feel like a lot of times Hollywood, when they come calling with authors quite early, so that they can try to get those rights quickly, and before the book hits big and becomes a cultural phenomenon.
Right, right.
Which didn't happen with Gone Girl.
No.
She was able to sell it after it was a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, well, do I think it would be really cool to see a film version of Devil in the White City? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it would be very expensive to make, which, they would have to recreate the White City, which doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And so maybe that's the reason that it doesn't happen. I don't know. So I started to read Eric Larson's new book, which came out just before the pandemic, and I realized that, and it's about Churchill and London during the Blitz.
Yes.
And I realized that I could not spend a pandemic. There was, between all of the political turmoil, and we experienced quite a bit of that in this neighborhood over the summer.
Yes.
And all of the pandemic, I just wanted to read things that would make me laugh, or things that would. I just couldn't read about London during the Blitz, basically.
Right,
I was
right.
like, I'm putting you aside.
Yes,
So I am going to pick it back up. I truly
No,
do intend to finish that
I feel
book.
the same way. I can only take so much bad news.
Right. So instead, I started reading some historical fiction that was a little less heavy. I read some Renee Rosen. If you know who she is, I'm not sure if she's still local. She was for quite some time. She wrote 3 or 4 historical fiction novels set in Chicago during, the 19th century and the early 20th century. One of them is about the first female reporter who, it's called White Collar Girl, who was ever an editor at the Chicago Tribune. And it's fiction. It's fiction. There's another book about that she wrote about Marshall Fields. Another one about a fictionalized version of chess records. So I read another one of hers during the pandemic, and I think she's written a couple of New York ones too, which is why I'm not sure if she still lives here, but I know that she grew up here. And we did an event with her many years ago when White Collar Girl came out.
Right.
And I still like her books. I'm still reading them. But I also read a book by Ali Brosh. It's her second book, and Hyperbole and a Half was her first. But this one's called Solutions and Other Problems, and it just made me laugh through my tears, which is one of my favorite emotions. And she's a woman who struggles with depression. And she writes stories about her life, just little vignettes really, and illustrates them. It's fun cartoons, basically. I think it's cartoons in the traditional sense, not like anime or graphic novels or anything so so grand as that.
Yeah.
But they're fun to look at in the way that you might like looking at an old Tom and Jerry cartoon or Bugs Bunny or something.
Oh, that's very clever on her part.
Yeah.
Well, do you think in the near future you'll be having any more events?
I want to.
Yeah.
I hope to in the fall.
Okay.
I don't know what that would look like quite yet.
Right.
I feel like I don't. It's not like we're taking people's temperatures when they come in the store to shop.
Right.
We've been open, as I said, since June for browsing. We do ask everyone to sanitize their hands or wear gloves or both, even if they want to. When they come in, we have very strict number of people we allow in here at a particular time. My number is 25, so and that includes staff. So we have to have people wait outside sometimes on Saturdays. But people, for the most part, seem to be okay with all of that. We don't allow food or drink in here. We can't have public restrooms like we did before. That's a city ordinance. Any business that has a public restroom has to have a separate employee restroom, and we don't have that in this building. As I mentioned, it's an 1896 building.
Yeah.
And so we can't do a lot of the things we did before. And again, I'm just going to say how amazing my staff has been, learning to deal with all of, like, helping me try to reinvent this business on the fly, helping me try to, deal with all these new ways, doing deliveries when I ask them to, staying off public transit, like just doing 100 different things that were not necessary before the pandemic.
Right.
And now we're all starting to get vaccinated, which is really good. But
well, hopefully by the fall, because I know Printers Row so far is still going to happen at the beginning of September.
And that's
September
great.
11th.
I'm glad the South Loop Association's decided to do it again.
We haven't heard anything to the contrary. So
Okay.
And most of Printers Row is an outdoor event.
It is.
So we're just keeping our fingers crossed that it will happen. I think it will if the numbers don't surge.
And I'm sure CWA has like a real role, like with Printers Row, now that it's back with the South Loop Association.
Right.
I suspect with the Trib it maybe wasn't quite the same, but yeah.
Well, we had our own tent for 2 days, and it was great. So we're praying that it does happen. So hopefully by this fall, things will improve.
Like, I don't know if we're going to have to ask people to show vaccination cards maybe to come to these events, like, because this is the other thing, right? So we're hosting public events indoors is what we're talking about.
Right.
And
different ball of wax.
It is different, and so I don't know if that would be necessary. And now they're saying, we may even have to get a booster shot, right? Like in 6 months or in a year. Nobody really knows where this is going quite yet.
Right. But everybody wants it to end so badly.
I know.
Yeah.
But I don't. I do. But I do feel like we are going to have some of these things that we're going to need to be doing for a while.
Right.
I don't feel like. I don't feel like we're going to stop asking people to clean their hands before they touch the books.
Right.
The virus lives for up to 72 hours on the surfaces in bookstores, including books themselves.
Yeah.
So if we can't possibly clean the 70,000 volumes we have in this place on a daily basis. That's just not realistic.
Right.
So we can ask the people to clean their hands before they touch anything, and hopefully not pass the virus to each other because of that.
And we're going to continue on with Zoom and hopefully have a hybrid, where we might have 20 people in an audience, but it'll still be a Zoom experience.
Right,
So,
and I think
you
I think
know,
that
that
that's
might work for later on in the year,
And-
just to get back to the physical, get back to the people and an audience. You know?
right. Well, you know, I mean, most of our events had before the pandemic were between 25 and 50 people that were coming to every single one. So I don't know if I want to get up into the 40s and 50s
Right,
in the
right.
same way that we did before. I mean, we that event space that we have can hold up to 100 seated, and it can hold with standing room maybe 150, and we have filled that in the past. But I don't know how comfortable I am doing that right
Right,
now.
right.
It feels irresponsible because it's not that I don't want to host authors. I absolutely do. I love it. It's a great part of my job. But is having people come and meet their favorite authors in person important enough to risk it
Take
during
the
a
risk.
pandemic?
Right, right.
And
right.
that's the question I always have to ask myself with anything that
Right.
we do here.
And we're going to be asking that for a long time,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. Anyway, it has been so great talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
How can people contact you and your store? Let's give them all the information.
Okay, so we are After-words Bookstore. We're at 23 East Illinois Street in River North in Chicago, just down the street from Navy Pier. We are at 312-464-1110. We also have a website, www.after-wordschicago.com. And we're on Facebook.
And people can call and order a book.
People
And
can call and order a book. They can send us emails through our website. They can order through our shop on Bookshop online.
Right.
They can also, we sell, we have probably about 20,000 listings of our secondhand and first editions and things like that.
Wow, yes.
Up with a couple of, with a couple of different third-party vendors that allow us to sell, biblio.com being the primary one. And that you can get there through our website too and order those things.
Right, right. Well, I can't say how happy I am that you're doing as well as you are. It just is a great feeling because, you know, there's so much sad news coming out. And to hear these stories of the indie bookstore surviving. And I know it's always been a struggle against the big guys. But the fact
Well,
that
thriving is definitely not what we're doing right now, but
they're
we are surviving. We
Yeah,
are definitely surviving.
Is what it's all about at this point, and that's what's important. And thank you for everything you do. I mean, it's phenomenal.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for asking me to do this.
Oh, I'm so glad I did. Thank you, and all of our best wishes. And I want to thank all of our viewers for watching. And once again, go to chicagoorg.com, chicagorights.org, and check out our website and also our YouTube videos. And you'll see our Zoom presentations. They're really, really good. Thank you ever so much.